In this episode of Your Leader's Edge, we're going to take a look at what's been happening in our nation this last week and see what we can learn. L-E-A-R-N, learn. Thanks for joining me. Hello, leaders. Like many of you, I've been really troubled by the events of this last week. I've had quite a few sleepless nights thinking about the hurt and pain in our nation and what, if anything, that I could do about it, being just a small voice in a small place. But I have the privilege of working with leaders every day of my life. And every one of those leaders has influence and can touch lives. That's what I believe in, the power of leadership, and that's why I do what I do. That's why I started this company, Leader's Edge. And so what I thought we would do in this episode of Your Leader's Edge is just take a look at this situation and each of us just own our place in it and see what we could do. Let me give you some of my perspective and some of my background for what it's worth. So I grew up in New Mexico, and I've shared with you that my childhood wasn't the best. My dad died when I was really young, and we had a childhood. In my childhood, we had a family that was really close to us, an African-American family, Jerry and Zelma Bridges and their daughter Tamika. And Tamika was about a year younger than myself. They were good friends of our family. In fact, they lived with us for a while. And I didn't know any different. I was just a kid, and I thought this was normal. Looking back through hindsight, this is in the early 70s. This is coming right out of the civil rights movement and all the turmoil of that. I recognize this is New Mexico. It's not Alabama, but it had to be pretty different. My dad died when I was very young, and Jerry and Zelma took me in as their son, so to speak, an adopted son. And I would go over to their house just about every day after school. We moved outside of the city together, and we had two different houses, and I'd go over there and play ball with them and eat dinner with them and play with Tamika. And again, I didn't know any different. And looking back now, I can tell you what an impact that made on my life. I was just talking with a friend of mine, an African-American brother, and just that impact that had on my life of planting a seed of just the beauty of the tapestry of our different colors and experiences and backgrounds. Growing up in New Mexico, in addition to that incredibly warm experience from Jerry and Zelma and Tamika, I was surrounded by the Hispanic, Mexican, Latino culture and the Native American Indian culture. And I learned all about those cultures, both the atrocities that happened to them in our nation and the beauty that they added to this tapestry. And most of my friends were Mexican Americans, Hispanics, and last names of Vega and Sanchez and Trujillo and Aguilera. And in one of the cities that I lived in, I was a minority. And I consider this just a beautiful experience. So I've given much of my adult life to help crossing some of those bridges and boundaries that have been built in the last 400 years of our country. And I've had a wonderful experience of not just in our country building some of those bridges with forums and get-togethers and conversations, but around the world working in different countries as well, in Kenya and India, and Uganda and Mexico. So I do believe I have some things to share. Now, not all those things are positive. Growing up in this variety of different cultures and traveling and working in different cultures, I have some of the negative experiences as well. I remember as a little boy living in a predominantly Hispanic town. Most of my friends were brown, and I was the white kid. And I remember one time we were all gathered around, and I was the only white kid there. And all my friends were gathered around, and other kids were gathered around. And this one older kid was handing out, I don't know if it was M&Ms or Skittles, I can't quite remember. And he would ask me to reach my hand out, and I'd reach my hand out. All the others would reach their hand out, and he'd put a candy, and we'd eat it. And it didn't take me long to realize that what he was really doing is he was comparing my skin color to the skin color of the kids around me, because I was the only white kid. And I looked back at that, and I just and even then, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I remember one time We were working in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, predominantly black neighborhood, and we had a day off, and there's some guys playing ball across the street at a basketball court. And I grabbed my basketball, I was a pretty good player at that time, and ran across the court, just excited to play. And I walked on and I called next, and they finished their game, and one guy made it very clear with an abundance of racial slurs in my direction that I was not welcome here. And I thought, okay, all right. I hadn't been called names like that since childhood. I know every possible racist slur in Spanish to a white guy. And I wasn't going to leave. That stuff doesn't bother me. So I just stayed, called next again. No, called next again. I stayed there for a whole hour till one of the guys on the other team championed me and said, let's let him play. Come on, man. And so he brought me on his team. And I'm happy to say he and I went on to crush the team of this racist bigot guy. I was in Washington, D.C. going to a march, and this is in my early 30s, didn't have much money, so I stayed in a hotel on the outskirts of town that I could afford. I was walking toward the Washington Mall, and this taxi driver came by, he swung by, he says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm just hiking into town. There's a few miles into town. I'm just hiking in town to go to this march." And he said, "Son, you can't be here. It's too dangerous for you." Inferring because I was white, it was too dangerous for me. So he let me get in the taxi. He drove me into D.C., into the mall. And when he dropped me off, he said this, "I probably just saved your life." And it just dawned on me that I was at risk of being killed because I was white. And I remember one time with my stepdad. My dad had died and my mom remarried, and we were in a Mexican restaurant in New Mexico. When I say Mexican restaurant, I don't mean because they serve tacos and burritos. I mean, it was owned by Mexican nationals who had come to the States. My dad was a Mexican Indian, and so we're a mixed family. So my mom is blonde hair, blue eyes, white girl, and he's Hispanic and Native American, and so we have mixed kids. And I remember them getting an argument with management, and there were some heated words exchanged, and the service was terrible and the food was horrible. And we left and got in the car and said, "Dad, what was that all about?" He said, they didn't want us here because I married a white girl and we had white kids. In fact, my son was a half-breed. So I've experienced a few things in my life, and I've much more to share, but I don't need to go on. Now, hear me clearly. I'm not pretending that my experiences, they're just a sliver of what many experience every day. I recognize that. They're just a sliver and a microcosm of what many experience every day, being disenfranchised. And that Washington, D.C. story, that could actually be a story about white privilege, because that's the first time I felt really unsafe not being where I belong. And many people feel like that every day. So I won't pretend, I will not pretend that my experiences are large scale. They're just a glimpse. They're a taste of what many face every day. But here's what I can say, is that through those experiences, I've learned. I've learned what it's like to have conversations across racial lines, ethnic lines. And that's what I want to pass on today. Just learn. L-E-A-R-N. I'm going to share a point on each of those. The things that I've learned through the years about building bridges. So I hope you're taking notes. L-E-A-R-N. The L is listen. I strongly believe the very first thing we need to do when we come to people that are different than us in any way, shape, or form is listen. And I don't mean listen to respond. Listen to understand. I look at Facebook feeds and I watch the news and I see a lot of people shouting and telling and talking, but very few people are listening to what other people have to say. The L is for listen. One of my favorite things to do that I can tell you has helped me build bridges wherever I go is to sit down and ask questions, especially of kids. I remember we were in Kenya about 4 or 5 years ago with the Luo tribe doing some community service. And I do this everywhere I go. I sit down with a pad of paper and a pen in hand, and it's usually the kids first. The kids start coming around, And I began to ask them about their language. How do you say chair? How do you say light? How do you say camera? How do you say man? How do you say table? And I'll write it down and I'll speak it back to them. And I'll mess up and they'll giggle. And I began to ask questions about their culture and how they see things. I do this everywhere I go. And I have learned that when you ask questions and listen, it's an automatic bridge builder. I think we need to learn to listen more, even if we don't agree. I've had conversations in airplanes with people from other nations about what they see in America and how we travel and how we speak. The most important part of learning is listening. I hope everyone watching this will be able to set down or set aside your impulse to respond, your impulse to react, no matter where you come from. And could we stop talking and start listening? The L is listen. The E is empathize. The E in learn is empathize. Now, I have a friend of mine named Lee, and he taught me this great little analogy. We're talking about marriage, and he said, I've learned the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is when I come upon someone in a pit, I yell down at them, I'm so sorry you're in that pit. Oh, it's a terrible pit to be in. And empathy is when we come upon someone in a pit and we climb down in the pit with them and put our arms around them and let our emotions commingle with their emotions. So right on the heels of listening is empathy. And it's when we let our emotions empathize and connect with others. Now, let me say this. I cannot relate to being the victim of systemic prejudice or sexism or fill in any number of blanks. I cannot relate to what it's like to be have an addiction run through my life or be trapped by drugs or alcohol. I can't relate to that, but I can relate to feelings of loss and anger and bitterness and resentment. So while we may not have the same experiences, we certainly can have the same emotions. So when you come across someone in a pit or someone sharing their experiences, you may not have the same experiences, but you can empathize because you are human and you can have the same emotions. One of the most important things we can do is listen and then connect with other people's experiences. A, acknowledge. The A in learn is acknowledge. Listen, empathize, acknowledge. Acknowledge what? Acknowledge another person's inherent value. Honor. Honor them as a human being. Apart, skin color, education, economic status. Acknowledge their value as a human being. Acknowledge their pain. Acknowledge their experience. Show the respect that they deserve simply for being human. Acknowledge past wrongs. In America, we do have 400 years of systemic racism. That's just true. And it's not just to blacks. Again, I grew up in New Mexico. I learned all about the oppression of Native American Indian tribes, Mexico and Mexicans. I mean, I live in New Mexico. I was reminded all the time how the American government basically stole what is now Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. Acknowledge that. It's true. Chinese working on the railroads, Japanese internment camps. We could go on and on. That's real. That's our real history. Acknowledge that. Acknowledge that we don't understand what a lot of people might be feeling. Acknowledge that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I acknowledge who you are and what you've been through in your past and your history. Nothing wrong with that at all. So listen, empathize, acknowledge. Now this next one's a little bit touchy. Recognize bias. The R in learn is recognize bias. As I was thinking about what the R should be in this, the initial response was respect. Obviously, I believe in respect. I put it under the A, acknowledge value, that's respect. Acknowledge people's stories, that's respect. When I shared with some friends what the R should be, and I said what I really want to do is talk about recognizing bias, someone were like, don't say that. You're gonna get some negative feedback for just saying there's bias out there. Well, that's kind of silly. Recognize there's bias. And I've traveled around the world enough to know this. There is bias everywhere. Everywhere. Every tribe, every tongue, every ethnicity, every language, every people group has bias. It's not a white issue. This is a human issue. I've already shared with you some of my experiences coming towards me as a white person. Everybody has bias. In Kenya, the Luo and the Maasai, there's bias. In Northern Africa, what do we have? The Hutu and the Tutsi. In Ireland, we have Catholics and Protestants. I mean, there's bias everywhere. Let's play a little game. I'm going to share some people group names, and I want you just to check in on your feelings, your emotions, and your thoughts just when I say the people group label. Millionaires, rich people, homeless, Republicans, Democrats, conservative, liberal, millennials, boomers, Zoomers, Catholics, Protestants, Mexicans, African Americans, white people, Native American Indians, Asians, Muslims, gays. I could go on and on. Some of those people groups, your emotions had a positive bias toward. You leaned toward them emotionally. You did. Some of those people groups that I said, you leaned away from them emotionally. You did. I know you did. Every one of us has bias. And most of the time, that bias comes from past hurts done by a person in that people group. And then we have grouped everyone in that people group with those negative feelings. That's how bias starts. So you may or I may have had a run-in with someone and may have been hurt, and I have a scar or a wound, and I will apply that wound to each person that's in that group. I could have said men, women. That's what bias is. That's how it started, and then it can be handed down from generation to generation. Little Susie, little Johnny. We all know that blank does blank. So R is recognized bias, and we all have it. And if you pretend you don't have it, you're simply fooling yourself. It's a lie you're telling yourself. You do, I do, we all do. Recognize the bias, but then do this. Make sure that we do not apply that bias to each human being we meet. We simply apply that bias to the person who brought that wound in our life. And it could have been a number of people that brought that wound in our life. Where we get in real trouble is when we take those wounds or those experiences or those biases and apply them to everyone in that group. That's when it becomes prejudice and bigotry. First, we recognize in ourselves, then we begin to teach ourselves that every single person, they get to earn or disqualify themselves from our favor based on our interaction with them individually, not as a group. So each individual hopefully begins with great honor and respect. Then if they disqualify themselves from honor and respect, it's because of their own individual actions or behavior. And we do not apply that to a group of people. So recognize bias. Learn. Listen. Listen to understand. Empathize. Let your emotions, even if you don't have the same experiences, let your emotions connect with people that are hurting. Acknowledge honor, value, respect, stories. Let me go back to acknowledge for a second. I should have said this earlier. Acknowledge the fact, one of the phrases that I can't stand is colorblind. We're all colorblind. We see each other the same. That's ridiculous. Stop it. I have learned a great deal from the people in my life who are different than me. Their experiences are different. Their people group history is different. I'm a better person because of my experiences with people very different from me. I acknowledge that their differences have made me better. I call it this beautiful tapestry and all these different colors and experiences woven in my life. I acknowledge that difference is beautiful. So stop with the being colorblind stuff. That's silly. It had good intent, but it's not true. Acknowledge that differences make us better. So listen, empathize, acknowledge, recognize your bias, but do not apply it to an individual. Try to remove all of that. Apply it only to the people who brought you hurt. Recognize bias. And next steps. What are you going to do next? Next steps. I'll give you a couple recommendations. Read some books on this subject. I've grown up with this history in New Mexico, and I read and learned. It's in our public school system about Native Americans and the abuses there, and Hispanic in Mexico and America and the abuses there. So I went on to learn about the civil rights movement. I read books, MLK, civil rights movement. Read a book, pick up a good book, educate yourself, watch a movie. There's some really good movies on about this. Selma, a new one out, Just Mercy, The Butler, many more. I can't just think off the top of my head. There's many more. Find some movies that help educate you on this subject. Most importantly, connect. Take a next step to connect with someone who has a different skin color than you do. Walk across the room, walk across the cul-de-sac, go out to coffee, and simply ask, how are you doing? How do you feel about all this? Like, what emotions does that bring up? This is the conversation I've been having this week with my friend. What emotions does this bring up? When you see this, tell me what you see. I know what I'm seeing. Tell me what you see. Take the next step and connect. My friends, my goal through this is simply that every one of us has some influence. And probably none of us watching this has influence on a national scale. And if you're like me, I feel helpless on the national scale. But locally, there's a lot I can do. Locally, every single person I connect with, I can make sure I honor, value, and respect them. You can do the same. So I hope this time together has inspired you to learn and take a step of connection so that we can make what comes out of this better than what came before it. Love you all. Thank you for your time. Lead well.